welcome back to Code Emily. Today we're going to talk about refactoring and why you might want to refactor your code base. Let's get into it. First off, what is a refactor? It's the process of improving the internal structure of the code without changing any of its functionality. Kind of like having an internal wound that no one else sees, but for you it affects your everyday life a lot. Your code may have internal wounds that are hindering your everyday life. As developers, we've seen code bases that are, let's say, scary. It's hard to understand them without reading documentation, a lot of extra training. Features might be taking a long time to write, even if you're a React expert. Some of the common reasons why the code may have gotten to a point where it needs a refactor are: the code base was built too quickly. You really need to push out your code by a certain date, and speed is favored over quality code. A code base that is built upon speed and not organization and efficiency will actually later on lead to the opposite of speed, because it'll be more difficult to use and write more features on top. Another reason could be the code base is older and outdated. Maybe new technology has come along. Maybe you've thought about it, and switching to server-side rendering could optimize your code base. Maybe you're still using an old version of React that uses lifecycle methods and it needs to be upgraded to the latest versions of React. Another very common one that's really incredibly frustrating: someone started up this code base who isn't at the company any longer, and it's assumed that the code must have been written that way for a reason, but it's unclear if that's actually the case. Other code has now been written on top of it in a similar bad pattern out of fear of breaking the app. Changing one thing might cause a huge bug, because you don't really know what you're changing. Another reason to refactor is that you simply go about your day and you realize that, hey, the code base could actually be optimized by doing this, that, and the other thing. There are different types of refactors. Two main ones. The first one is a full refactor. What this typically looks like is starting a new code base fresh. The old code base can be used as more of a reference, and the new, fresh code base is what you're focused on. This one definitely has upsides. You can research, decide, and plan out how everything needs to be organized, and you don't need to work with that code that has been outdated. You can choose the best tech stack for you from scratch. You'll be able to have a fully up-to-date, optimized application, which is great for lots of reasons, one of them being bringing in new talent that wants to work on the latest technology. However, there definitely are downsides. This takes a lot of time, effort, and work. It can be hard to convince a team to go with this approach. Typically, you'll need to halt any features, because if you're focused on writing a new app and you're refactoring all of the old features in the new app, it's not a great idea to focus on putting new features into the old app. And you can't release the new app until it's at a complete state. So it's hard to put out any new features until that refactor is done, which can be very difficult to convince your team to go forward with. If you do add a new feature or fix a bug, you'll need to fix it or add a new feature in two places rather than one, and the old code base and the new code base. You'll potentially need to migrate your customers from the old app to the new app, but that also could be a positive experience if the old app does have a lot of issues. So that's scenario one, the full refactor, when scenario two is a much slower approach, focusing on one piece at a time. This can be things like refactoring pages of an application, refactoring utility functions. Say your utility functions could potentially be more performant, or you find a pattern throughout your app would be better suited for a utility function rather than be in individual files throughout your app. It's much easier to test in a utility function if you're only doing it one place. Refactoring a page or a pattern that pages are using. A React example for this could be adding a custom hook that you're using for each fetch throughout your app. Maybe all of your fetches have similar logic, and you can pull that logic out into a custom hook. Refactoring a component or a pattern that components are using. A React example of this would be updating your prop names to be more aligned throughout the app. Say for all booleans you have in your app, you want the word is to preface them. For example, like is blue, is red, rather than just red, blue. This will establish a pattern of prop names throughout your app that will then make it easier for other developers to understand going forward. Important things to remember when you're doing a refactor. Organization is key. Make sure that we're focusing on putting things in files, in folders. Bring things from big, long files into smaller components, smaller files that are easier to read, to test, and to consume. Also, having a file or folder structure, in that case, you have all of your components under a folder. You have all of your pages under a folder, and therefore you have things like routes or indexes for pages labeled the same way for each page. Focus on creating reusable components and making it easier to write code in your application for other developers and for your future self, because you're probably going to forget what you wrote in 6 months. I always do. Focus on naming. I talk about this in a lot of my videos, but it's just one of the most important things in any code language. Naming is key. I'm not talking about keys. I'm talking about names. Component names, file names, utility function names, variable names. They should be super clear as to why and when you'll need to use them. And also even things like patterns for variables, like I was talking about earlier for Booleans, is blank, is red, etc. Those are really great patterns to establish too. Documentation is great, but it should not be necessary for other devs to read documentation to understand your code base. A hint, engineers don't like to read. Don't over-optimize. Don't guess when it comes to refactoring. Don't say, oh, I might later on need this prop, so I'm going to add it now. If you don't need the prop in a component, don't add it. Add it later when it's needed. You might be writing code that really is just adding more fluff on something that could be simpler. Simplicity is key. Don't overplan your refactor. Things will come up that will mess up any plan. Make sure that your plan is adaptable and you're able to move on the fly, update things as you go. And after the refactor, what happens? Well, you probably won't need to refactor again very soon if you're always refactoring. I know that sounds confusing, but we should always be innovating. We should always be refactoring. We should always be thinking about any sort of patterns or ways that our code could be better optimized, more reusable, etc. We should be doing small refactors as we go. We should always focus on the latest technology and see if we might want to upgrade. You can carve out time each week and make sure that you're feeling good about where your application is at. Plus, after you've done, a big refactor, it should be easier from there to refactor even more. Thank you so much for watching. I'm so happy that you ended up here. This is Code Emily, and I have lots of different videos about React, about software engineering. Also, if you've done a refactor recently, I want to hear about it. Comment below and talk to me about it. I love refactoring. Huge nerd about it. I love innovating. I love trying to figure out patterns. I love puzzles. So tell me about it. And if you like this channel, consider subscribing. I'll be back.